In his best-selling book, Desiring God, John Piper describes his journey into Christian hedonism. In the introduction, Piper explains how he found in himself, quote, an overwhelming longing to be happy, a tremendously powerful impulse to seek pleasure. Yet at every point of moral decision, I said to myself that this impulse should have no influence. Piper's concern was that his desire for happiness or pleasure, when he did something morally good, would lessen its goodness. He writes, I figured that the goodness of my moral action was lessened to the degree that I was motivated by a desire for my own pleasure. But to be motivated by a desire for happiness or pleasure when I volunteered for Christian service or went to church, that seemed to be selfish, utilitarian, mercenary, and that, Piper thought, was wrong. Piper describes the insights that converted him to Christian hedonism. During his first quarter in seminary, he was introduced to the argument for Christian hedonism by one of its greatest exponents, the mathematician and philosopher Blaize Pascal, who had written, All men seek happiness, this is without exception. Piper eagerly accepted the wisdom of Pascal. This statement so fitted with my own deep longings and all that I had ever seen in others that I accepted it and have never found any reason to doubt it. On the Desiring God website, John Piper expressed his deep gratitude to Pascal. He writes, In 1968, Pascal and C.S. Lewis and Jonathan Edwards and Dan Fuller and the Bible teamed up to change my life forever with those words, joy, 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 tears of joy. Here's how Pascal blew away my resistance to joy. Piper again quotes Pascal's truism, all men seek happiness, this is without exception. Whatever different means they employ, they all tend to this end. This is the motive of every action of every man, even of those who hang themselves. Piper writes, I suspected this was true, but I always feared that it was sin, that wanting to be happy was a moral defect. But then God conspired with these writers to force me to reread the Bible, to give it a chance to have its true say. And what I found there concerning joy changed me forever. Having been convinced by the arguments of Pascal, Piper decided to follow the way of Christian hedonism. He writes, In a matter of weeks I came to see that it is unbiblical and arrogant to try to worship God for any other reason than the pleasure to be found in Him. Then Piper discovered the sermon of C.S. Lewis called The Weight of Glory, and comments, quote, I had never in my whole life heard any Christian, let alone a Christian of Lewis's stature, say that all of us not only seek, as Pascal said, but also ought to seek our own happiness.
I picked up a book by C.S. Lewis in Vroman's bookstore in 1968, the fall, and nothing has been the same ever since. The first page of The Weight of Glory, and then later I opened his book, Reflections on the Psalms, page 93, and everything was settled.
John Piper is overwhelmed by what he regards as the spiritual wisdom of C.S. Lewis, a British Anglo-Catholic author and lay theologian.
This year is the year for our focus on C.S. Lewis. To think about him and speak about him, have been so profoundly influenced by him, as have been hundreds of thousands, yes, millions of people through his writings. Eyes have been opened to see the world in ways we didn't see it before Lewis came into our lives. And so for myself, at least, I will say Lewis has had, since about my 21st or 20th year on, a massive influence in the way I see the world and the way I think about Christianity.
Piper looked back with regret that it had taken him so long to find hedonism. Quote, "All those years I had been trying to suppress my tremendous longing for happiness, but now it started to dawn on me that this persistent and undeniable yearning for happiness was not to be suppressed, but to be glutted on God. The growing conviction that praise should be motivated solely by the happiness we find in God seemed less and less strange." Having been persuaded by the writings of Pascal and Lewis, Piper says that when he turned to the Psalms for himself, he found the language of hedonism everywhere, for the quest for pleasure was not even optional, but commanded. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desire of your heart. Piper concludes, "I find in the Bible a divine command to be a pleasure seeker. In short, I am a Christian hedonist, not for any philosophical or theoretical reason, but because God commands it."
And the shortest description of Christian hedonism is God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him. My pathway into this understanding over the last 30 years or so is mainly affected by Jonathan Edwards and C.S. Lewis and the Apostle Paul.
If God is most glorified in you, when you are most satisfied in Him, and if Christ paid the price of His infinite blood for that glory through that satisfaction, your vocation for the rest of your life on this planet 24/7 is to maximize your pleasure in God. Period. No qualifications.
At the Passion Conference of 1997, John Piper preached his message of Christian hedonism to many thousands of young people.
If this is true, that God is most glorified in you when you are most satisfied in Him, and therefore there is no tension or contradiction between your satisfaction in Him and His glorification in you, then the vocation of your life is to pursue your pleasure. I call it Christian hedonism.
During his journey into hedonism, Piper has committed the serious error of starting with the ideas of men and then turning to the Bible to support these man-made ideas. This is a wrong use of Scripture and leads to all kinds of false teaching. The correct way of Christian thinking is always to start with the Bible. In seeking to justify his journey into Christian hedonism, Piper is guilty of the serious error of proof texting, the error of taking a passage of Scripture out of context to prove a doctrinal point. The Bible is written in such a way that most verses cannot be correctly interpreted in a standalone fashion. But Piper's hedonism comes not from biblical truth, but from his overwhelming longing to be happy, his tremendously powerful impulse to seek pleasure. We must conclude that Piper's hedonism is a man-made philosophical system that comes from the ideas of C.S. Lewis and Blaize Pascal. So-called Christian hedonism is a heretical doctrine which has no place in the Christian church.